Hi everyone. You've seen me running around this weekend. My name's Abbi Pattenden. I'm currently president of the National Association of Funeral Directors, as well as being a working funeral director. Thank you. And I'm here today to talk to you about attitudes to death and dying in the arches. I'm going to skip through a lot of my early stuff because it's the end stuff that is interesting, I hope. Fingers crossed. Oh my God, just dropped my mic in the water. Round of applause for me for doing that.
Right, are you okay?
Sorry, yes.
There we go. Let me take this away.
Yay!
Yeah, that's great.
Check me out for that skill, well done. And now I look like I'm singing to you, so that's really good news. So I'll just skip through my early bits, as I was saying. So the NAFD is the UK's largest trade association. About 80% of the funerals which are carried out in the UK will be done by a member. I've been the president for nearly a year now. We're elected in May for a one-year term. Here is a very exciting photo of me looking like a grown-up with my magnificent chain on. There we go. And I'm very proud to say that I am the youngest woman to have ever held the position. So a little bit of statistical stuff. So about one person dies in England and Wales for every 110 people. I've used a lot of stats from Leo Horsemeyer, for which I'm very grateful, and done some maths. And I think that we know of about 150 to 180 people in the arches. This is a combination of the people who we hear, the people who we don't hear, and the known connections that they have. There are also other people who we know exist, but we don't know in the same way. So people like the staff who work at Grey Gables or Damara, people who you would expect to hear about if they died. And I think that this is approximately 200-ish people, give or take. So therefore, you should really expect to hear 1 to 2 deaths in the arches per year. That doesn't happen. And what I want to look at is why we get less, who the people are that we see dying, and that's interesting me. But I just want to say a little bit about farming. Now, farming is incredibly dangerous. 29 people died in farming in 2017 to 18. It doesn't sound very much. It's actually 19.5% of all the industrial deaths in the UK in that period. And it's the most dangerous occupation to be working in when it's measured by rate. So rate of industrial deaths is measured by number of deaths per 100,000 people working in the industry. And this little table here shows you agriculture is the 8.2. That's deaths in industries per 100,000 workers, 2013-14 to 2017-18. And there's a rate of fatal injury 18 times as high as the average across all industries. So there's been a thing called the Farm Safety Partnership created, which is aiming to decrease deaths by 50% by 2023. If everything else stayed the same, it would still make farming the second most dangerous occupation. And what's really interesting is that 44% of people who are self-employed who died in industrial accidents died in farming. So this is the characters that we know, the Eds, the Dodgy Tims, Pats and Tonys, you know, the characters that we know. The last death in the arches was John of a farming-related incident in 1998. Tony had a near miss with Otto the Bull in 2014, but I'm going to suggest that really we should hear about people having farming-related accidents through the NFU. David would be involved in this kind of work. Now, since Phil died in 2010, there have been, as I say, you'd expect to have heard of about 18 to 20 people die. There's actually been 9 human deaths, which you can really categorise in 4 broad ways. So you've got your silent characters, you've got your characters who weren't speaking at the time that they died, and in 2 cases that's preempted by the death of the performer. You've got your less established herd character, or what I've called a plot-driven death, including Paul, who was sort of brought in to have an affair with Lillian and then, as we heard about yesterday, died. And that kind of set up the Ambridge Extra of that year. Then you've got Heather, Ruth's mum, who died following the sort of will they, won't they move, and sort of that was one of the other things that put the tin hat on them moving away from Brookfield, really. And then I've put Nick in this, which you might think is controversial because actually it's a recent death and it's what's prompted me to do this paper. Nick only appeared 3 times in 2017 until she started being re-established in November before her death in February of 2018. She was the 52nd most heard character that year, which is equivalent to, I think, Nolatando, who doesn't even live in Ambridge. She wasn't a major character. She got re-established in November and died in the following February. So I'm going to suggest that the death which is unique is Nigel. Now, Nigel was established in the drama. He wasn't introduced or reintroduced into the Archers purely for the purposes of dying. So in this group of 9 people, he's kind of unique, really. Having said that they're different, I would just say there are some similarities between Nick and Nigel. Both of them were married to children of main families. They had unexpected deaths, leaving young families behind. And we heard virtually their final moments in the drama, and that also makes them unique within those groupings as well. What I'm going to suggest, though, is that the events which led on from those deaths were portrayed very differently in the drama. And I'm going to argue that they contrast with how society has come around to treating death in the intervening time. Now, death is a taboo. We know this. A lot of people don't want to talk about it. In a 2016 survey carried out by the National Association of Funeral Directors and YouGov, 20% of people, actually it's just slightly over that, said that nothing would ever prompt them to think about their own funeral. Nothing, ever. Out of a list of options they were given, including someone else in their family dying. Nothing would ever prompt them to think about it. So that's a small but significant minority of people. However, there are ways that people who do want to be engaged with death can talk about it. I'm just going to run through these very quickly. So there's the Death Cafe movement, which started just after Nigel died, funny enough. And there are now 8,000 death cafes in 65 countries. It's not meant to be grief counselling, it's just a group-directed discussion about death. And it always includes cake. Very appropriate here. The Church of England has a similar thing which is slightly more structured. It's called Grave Talk. Again, it's a conversation model, but they have conversation cards to prompt people. They're on 5 topics: life, death, society, funerals and grief. And again, they always include cake in their Grave Talk sessions. And then there's Dying Matters, which is a coalition of individual and organisational members, including the National Association of Funeral Directors. It was set up by the National Council for Palliative Care in 2009, and since 2010 they've had an annual Dying Matters Awareness Week, and members of the coalition use that week as an opportunity to try to raise awareness. The aim of the Dying Matters Coalition is to help people to talk more openly about dying, death and bereavement and make plans for the end of life. There's also been the influence of celebrities. So Jeff Brazier, Rio Ferdinand and Simon Thomas have all been very public about how the death of the mothers of their children have affected them and their children. In the latter 2 cases, they were their wives. In the first one, it was an ex-partner. And there's also a podcast, which some of you may have heard of, called You, Me and the Big C, which is about cancer. It won an ARIA award, and then that generated a lot of publicity. There was more publicity when one of its co-presenters, Rachel Bland, died. And then recently, last month, I think, there was more publicity because Deborah James, another one of the co-presenters, has released a book about living with stage 4 bowel cancer. And it's a very, very inspirational podcast. I'd recommend it to people. It's absolutely brilliant. But this trend towards openness has not, in my opinion, been reflected in The Archers, where I feel we saw more storylines leading from Nigel's death 8 years ago than Nick's in the intervening time, which is when most of these movements have really gained traction. So these are the things that I would suggest led from Nigel's death: the rift between Elizabeth and David, Elizabeth's heart problems, Elizabeth's affair with Roy. We've seen recently that she ascribes her depression and Freddie's imprisonment, which I'm going to talk a little bit about more later. And I'd also say Lily and Russ as well. I do wonder whether Lily would be going out with an older, ostensibly unsuitable man if she hadn't lost her father figure at such a young age. I mean, it's impossible to know, of course. Now, in contrast to this, The issues that came around at the time that Nick died were all about resolving or advancing other plot points. So we found out that Nick actually was the person who ran over Matt, and that was the resolution of that storyline. At the funeral, a lot was made of the fact that Alice's alcohol issues seemed to be being exacerbated, and there was also a bit of an idea of a reconciliation between Will and Ed and Emma. Now, since then, there has been other storylines. I'll talk about those in a minute. And there was the storyline about the rota for the childcare. And it did show the difficulties of what can happen in a family where you go from being a two-parent to a one-parent family, but it didn't feature the children. And I sort of wonder, the outcome of it seemed to be one of these periods where we're reminded that Susan is not actually a bad person all the time. Now, I know what people are going to say, and that this feels like an unfair comparison because of the length of time since Nigel has died compared to the recent period of time that Nick has died. But what I'm going to say, and what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my presentation, is that we could have had storylines at the time of Nick's death which would have reflected not only key issues within discussions in the deaf community, but also things which would have been of genuine interest to the audience, I would think. And I'd just like to talk about three of those. So the first one is funeral affordability, and I'm going to skip through this because it's just figures really, but the average, a typical burial in 2017 cost £4,257. I did some anecdotal research. I rang a funeral director near Inkbarrow. I pretended to be someone who had someone who was going to die quite soon. Sorry, probably shouldn't say that. I phoned a natural burial ground as well and asked them about their prices. And I think this is probably about right, the amount that Will would have been expected to pay for Nick's funeral. Now, I've got no idea whether Will had access to that kind of money, and obviously it's notorious that money isn't ever something that we hear that much about in the Archers. He would have been entitled to a bereavement support payment at the higher rate of £3,500 and up to 18 subsequent payments of £350, which I presume are designed to fill the gap in a lack of income on a regular basis from a second parent. This is all because of having children and access to child benefit. And that's it. That's all he would have been entitled to. Now, we know that Will is obviously always contrasted with Ed and Emma in the affluent stakes, and he's got a lot of money compared to them. So what would, if Emma had died instead, what would Ed have been entitled to? Now, Ed would have been entitled to the same thing, and possibly, depending on the financial circumstances and benefits, nothing else. And we know that branch of the Grundy family, that branch struggles from day to day in even keeping going with the most simple things. Where would they have found their £4,257? There is a payment called the Social Fund Funeral Payment, and it's designed to provide a contribution, notice that word, contribution, towards a simple, low-cost, respectful funeral. It's not designed to pay for the whole thing. But in any case, it's thought to be inadequate for the purpose. The average award is less than 35% of the estimated average cost. And there's a portion of it which is for other expenses, which is supposed to not include the necessities. Confusingly, other expenses includes a coffin. I don't quite understand how that's not a necessity, but never mind. And that amount has stayed at £700 since 2003. It hasn't gone up at all. In that time, inflation has risen by 57%. So for people who have got nothing or who are financially struggling, obviously any amount of money to have to access unexpectedly, it is too much. And the last, I think it was in January, we found out that local authorities in 2017 to 18 had spent £5.4 million on their statutory duty of environmental health funerals for people who live in their area but who don't have access to funds. And it led to this headline in The Independent: the rise of paupers funerals, a term which I hate, incidentally. It's undignified, it's Victorian, it increases the stigma. The rise of paupers funerals is a disgraceful reminder of Britain's inequalities. Now, discussion, as I say, I don't know whether Will could afford Nick's funeral or not, but discussion about the funds could have prompted the audience to talk about funerals and other issues more generally, which sort of leads on to my next topic. Have I got time to do my audience participation exercise or not really? Do you mind? Okay. If no one minds, and I should have said at the start, obviously I am talking about death, and you know, I again, as with yesterday, if this is a topic which is difficult for you, then that's fine, and you know, please, you know. Can I just ask anyone in the room who has a written plan of what they would like for their funeral to raise their hand? So quite a few of you, yeah? And can I ask you to keep it raised if the person or people who would be likely to be arranging your funeral know that and know how to access it? Okay. So, I mean, that's pretty good. It's a better response than I got from a group of humanist celebrants. So, but I mean, as you can see, there are an awful lot of us in this room who have not thought about this issue. Now, in 2018, we heard a family discussion over how to memorialise someone, the best way to remember them, and even to dispose of the body. It was a respectful and sensitive conversation, taking into account the preferences of the person who died, but also the wishes of other family members. Now, it would have been lovely if this had been Will and Beverly, Nick's mum, or even Will and some of the others in the family, but actually it was Elizabeth and Freddie about Topper when he died in July. He had to be put to sleep, and that was a conversation that would have been much better had about a human. Now, as we've heard, a significant minority of people will not discuss their funeral plans, and this is problematic. There's a study about everything to do with funerals and religious belief called Keeping the Faith, and particularly for people who have ambiguous faith, there is a real identified knowledge gap. And there's a charity called Independent Age who's characterised a lack of talking about wishes in advance as an exacerbation of conflict at the time of death. Now, last year, the NAFD did a survey asking people who'd arranged funerals what their experiences were and what they'd wanted from the funeral. And these were the things that were characterised as their key wishes: making it personal, making it a celebration of the person in their life, and following the wishes of the person who has died. And I think that's fairly understandable. I think all of us would go along with that. But in the same survey, only 10% of people said that they'd had a written plan to follow. 50% of the respondents knew not much or nothing about the funeral plans. How can you achieve the former if you know nothing about the latter? And this is a source of real distress to people. I know this from my professional experience. People get very upset when they don't know what the person would have wanted. And so therefore there's a detriment to bereaved people. And this is currently a hot topic. So just last month the BBC announced this programme, Miriam's Dead Good Adventure, where Miriam Margoyles is going to look at why we struggle to talk about dying, which she says makes people dying more difficult. So it is a hot topic, it's known out there. But the thing that I think is the worst thing that hasn't really been covered in the short time since Nick has died, and the issue that really should have been raised, is bereavement in childhood. Now, I would love to be able to stand here and talk to you as I did earlier about the number of people who died in industrial deaths, or the number of people who die full stop, about how many children are bereaved in childhood. But I'm afraid I can't, because there are no official statistics about it. No one collects them. And when you consider the ongoing effects that it has on people, it is an absolute scandal. Now, the figures that I'm going to quote are from the childhood bereavement charity Winston's Wish, who say that there are 45,000 children bereaved each year, including 36,000 of a parent. Outcomes include being a victim of bullying, trauma, ongoing depression, self-harm and offending behaviours. 41% of young offenders experience bereavement as a childhood, in their childhood. And I did kind of hope that Freddie might come out of his young offenders institution and find out that that was something that he'd had in common with some of the other inmates in there. And I don't know how well you can see these at the back, so I'll just read them. These are from the Winston's Wish website. We had no idea how to deal with the pain and the horror of my mother's death, nor the preceding years of torturous treatment. We closed down, my brothers moved away, and my father barely spoke to me. Within a year I was self-harming. I took myself to the GP without my father's knowledge and was prescribed antidepressants. I was not monitored while taking these and regularly took small overdoses. And another one, Grief, unimaginable grief, unsupported through no one else's fault, continues to impact on my daily life. A failed marriage, numerous lost relationships, still sleepless nights wondering if I could, even as a child, have done more. The feeling of helplessness, lack of control and fear are at the back of my mind daily. Now, our lack of ability to talk about death exacerbates feelings for these children who are bereaved. So I know someone whose mum died when he was 12. His headmaster was told, but when he went back to school, the family found that his headmaster hadn't told the rest of the teachers because he found it too awkward and didn't want to upset them. Now, even if teachers are willing, and I'm sure a lot of teachers are willing, fewer than 10% of teachers have had any bereavement training, and even fewer schools have a bereavement policy. However, that's all reactive in any case, whereas what's really needed is proactive efforts to help children understand. There's evidence from practitioners that children can be educated about death in a multidisciplinary way, which supports them in advance and prepares them for what will happen when they are bereaved. There are parallels with other topics, in SRE and PHSE. So, for example, sex and relationships. You can talk to children about loss and about missing someone before you ever talk about death, in the same way that you can talk about, consent and intimacy in relationships before you ever talk about biology. So in 2018, the Department of Health issued a consultation on SRE and PHSE, which sought to improve these subjects, which the consultation characterised as being about relationships, health and the wider world. Death, loss, bereavement, none of these words were even mentioned in the consultation, which is supposed to be about relationships in the wider world and how we prepare our children. What would have been really interesting about this in the Archers is that the family profile makes it really interesting. So there's a wide age range of children. I think Poppy was 4 when her mum died. I think Jake was about 14. Mia's somewhere in between. Obviously, it's a blended family, and so there's 2 other children, George and Kira, who are in between ages as well. And there's proximity of other children too. Now, I understand that child actors, it might be problematic, but you could have heard Ed and Emma talking about how they were going to tell Kira that Nick had died and answer her questions. You could have had Helen being concerned because they were going to talk about loss at Loxley Barrett and what impact would that have on Henry, for example. There are other ways to do it with raising awareness of this. Now, recently we've heard disagreements between Will and Mia about how to remember Nick, and I think it's great that Mia's finally, I would say belatedly, come in as a character. I'm really, really pleased about that. But I think that the focus has been quite a lot on Will. We could have heard about Kira making a memory box. We could have had Jake and Mia being involved in how they actually arranged the funeral and what the content was. They went to the grave too much in some people's opinion, but how often did the children want to go to the grave? We've got no way of knowing. What I'm going to suggest is that these storylines that did cover Nick's death were about the circumstances arising from her death, rather than the impact of the death itself. And I know that is a nuanced distinction, but I think it is a distinction. And I'm going to say that it was a real wasted opportunity to raise awareness in the way that the death did. Now, we all know that the plotline was designed to raise awareness of sepsis, and it worked. 15,000 people called the BBC Action Line about sepsis after Nick died. So we know people listen to the Archers, people pay attention to it, people want to find out more about the stuff that they hear. And so what I'm going to say is it's a shame that this didn't continue since Nick has died. There is a real necessity in this country to discuss these issues. And I'm going to say it would be particularly useful in a continuing drama. Quite often it's done in documentary, but a drama gives us space and it gives us time. Look at the recent episode with Elizabeth and her counsellor, 12 minutes just of that issue being given space. Imagine a 12-minute episode with I don't know, Jake and Mia talking about their mum and how they wanted to remember her. They're both speaking characters now. It could have been so powerful, and I just really think that it's a shame. I think it's good that Nick died. Perhaps I shouldn't say that, but I mean, I don't know. But I think obviously it's great that it raised awareness of sepsis, and as I said right at the start, people should be dying in the drama. But I just think that it's a pity that some of these really important issues weren't explored in more detail. And that's it from me. Thank you. I won't drop it into my water again. Any questions? Naughty. Oh,
loads.
Oh, loads. Oh, gosh.
Oh, death.
Death.
I'm about to do one of those questions that's really common things. You deal with people once they've died,
Yes.
you deal with people getting there.
Yes.
It's exactly the same problem discussing wishes around the end of life.
Yeah.
And I think there is an opportunity to discuss do not resuscitate orders, to discuss people's wishes around the
Yeah.
intensive care.
Yeah.
And I just really want to signpost a fabulous website called Talk CPR, which is a Welsh website designed by palliative care doctors. But it kind of gives you some tips on talking about what you want at the end of life with your family and how you can introduce that topic. And as a geriatrician, please do it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting following your talk yesterday. I really did think, there is a lot about in medicine that doctors aren't really trained, and doctors feel quite a lot of pressure to actually continue treating people past a time when actually it's feasible. And there was something on Twitter that I just saw this morning about the number of people who die in hospital as opposed to the number of people who want to die at home, because is medicine too I think solution oriented was and that actually doctors feel too much pressure to try to fix people when actually they should be looking at making them comfortable. So it's definitely, it is a thing. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
I want to know what you think of the way that Will handled Poppy and the other children, because he's had a lot of criticism from Emma about this, but actually some of what he's done actually seems to make sense to me. What do you think?
I mean, it's interesting. I saw someone say on one of the Archers' Facebook pages, Will's still a bastard. He's just a bastard who's lost his wife now. and I have to say that Will is not my favourite character. I think that obviously there are many different things. There's a possible young carer storyline coming up for Mia, isn't there? And I think there's a lot of things around that. If Jake was the one who still lived with him, would his expectations be the same? I think he might have been doing better to start off with, but I think recently, this whole thing about what is and isn't appropriate, what's appropriate for Jake and Mia to remember their mum is what's appropriate for them to remember their mum. But I wonder whether Nick was chosen because Will is one of those characters that is a bit, we kind of want to disagree with him, and I wonder whether it is meant to be a cautionary tale in a way, He's not most sophisticated of all the characters. I mean, I was just laughing. It's been a long time since I'd done maths at school, but I mean, I think we obviously haven't heard a lot of what's happened, but like anyone else, children need to be given time and space to grieve in their own ways. And if he has been doing that, then it would be the right thing.
Well, we're taking a question from this.
There.
Hi, I was just thinking about Winston's wish, because when actually Nick died, obviously I was aware of the charge, I was desperately thinking, shall I email the writers, although I knew it was too late because they weren't quite a few was to say, please use this opportunity to say about Winston's wish. I'm aware of a friend's family who immediately got in touch with them and made a huge difference for the children in terms of even going to the funeral and how they experienced how and stuff. So we were people doing it. If you ever emailed them, practice.
I have spoken. I've done I did a project during my presidential year. I've been doing a project on bereavement in childhood, and did some work with the chief exec of Winston's Wish, and I did ask him if he listens to the Archers, but I don't think he did.
Back. Yeah.
I've worked as a hospital chaplain, both in acute hospital and in hospice. So we've had to deal with children and parents who are dying. And I think it's really sad that Nick died so quickly that there wasn't the opportunity for the children to have any preparation at all. And certainly in the hospice, all children are offered through their parents to have counselling beforehand and afterwards as well. And I think in the acute hospitals they would try and do something similar. Your point about people making preparations for their actual funeral service is vital, I think. But another thing, when I've been talking to parents or to anybody of any age really, is have you made a will?
Yeah.
And that's absolutely crucial.
Show of hands, maybe. Who's got a will? Oh, not everyone.
I think people are frightened that if they make a will, it's going to make them die. And it's not.
Well, I'm proof for all of you that you can talk about death every day. It hasn't happened to me just yet. So, yeah, no, you are quite right. Yeah.
And final point, you talked about the actual